the wonderful introduction. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jacqueline, and I'm an analyst at TransitionZero. So in the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be sharing with you some of the insights from our recently published report, the CODISEC report. So specifically for this report, we critically examined 3 different advanced coal technologies, the first being ammonia co-firing, and then co-gasification or AIGCC plants, as well as carbon capture and storage or CCS or CCUS, as some of you might term it, and considered their potential roles in decarbonizing Japan's electricity sector. Before we go straight into the content, I'll just like to give a quick introduction on TransitionZero. TransitionZero is actually a climate not-for-profit, and we're currently headquartered in the UK. We have 2 key main broad work streams, firstly in the power sector and secondly in the heavy industry sector, and we aim to provide quality data and analysis to help with the decarbonization process for these 2 key work streams. Right. So now I'm very excited to share with you some of our key findings from our CODISEC report. So firstly, our analysis confirms that actually advanced coal technologies are expensive. Even the cheapest source of advanced coal technologies that we've considered, which is 20% gray ammonia co-firing, is actually 30% more expensive than traditional coal-fired power plants. And the contrast is actually even more prominent when you compare it with renewables. So amidst the turbulent commodity prices that we saw in the past few years, standalone solar and onshore wind in Japan is actually already cheaper than coal and many of the advanced coal technologies that we are going to cover today. Now, looking forward to 2030, under the dual pressures of declining renewable costs as well as rising carbon costs amidst tightening climate restrictions globally, advanced coal technologies will risk being priced out entirely from the market, leading to stranded asset risk into the future. Now, secondly, we found out with our report that the emissions reduction potential of these advanced coal technologies are typically overstated. Apart from CCS or CCUS, none of the advanced coal technologies have considered actually offer too much emissions reduction compared to baseline emissions of a traditional coal-fired power plant in Japan. Now, although CCS can help to reduce emissions at coal plants, it does come with its own set of unique problems. So the most critical being the lack of CO2 storage sites in Japan, and definitely high costs as well as efficiency penalties do very little to help the costs for CCUS in the power sector in Japan. Now, so the key findings of our report actually highlight that advanced coal technology is high costs as well as high emissions. So with this report, we hope to caution Japanese decision makers on their insistence to leave the door open for advanced coal technologies. And we feel like, Japan's bet on ammonia co-firing and other advanced technologies is looking increasingly divorced from what's happening globally, as well as within Japan in terms of economic, climate, and political realities. Now, the first clean coal technology that we're going to touch on today is ammonia co-firing. And I understand that this is going to be a key topic of interest, so I'm going to spend a bit more time on this. Now, as many of you already know, Japan has somewhat locked into ammonia co-firing with coal as a key emissions reduction strategy for the power sector. And the reason we believe this is so is because ammonia co-firing at existing coal plants does not require significant retrofits at existing coal plants. So this has somewhat emerged as the technology or a strategy of choice for many of the Japanese utilities, also to keep their coal fleet running. And before we dive straight into the content, I'll just like to have a quick refresher on some of the terminologies that we use and the different shades of ammonia. So gray and brown ammonia are actually produced using fossil fuel as feedstock, with natural gas being used in the former and coal in the latter. Blue ammonia refers to the use of CCS or CCUS technologies to reduce emissions from fossil-based ammonia, while green ammonia, on the other hand, gets its hydrogen from water electrolysis that's powered by renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar PV. Now, as it stands, only blue and green ammonia can be considered low or zero carbon fuel. Now, lastly, there's a group of emerging greener ammonia technologies that will look at sidestepping the traditional energy and emissions intensive Haber-Bosch process and entail newer and novel methods of ammonia synthesis. So Japan is actually a R&D leader on this front, and unfortunately, none of this greener ammonia production technologies are actually commercially available yet. It remains in the R&D stage, but there's definitely a lot of interest to advance on that front as well. Now, back to the key meat of our analysis, looking at ammonia co-firing. So one of the first few challenges that we see in terms of advancing or commercializing ammonia co-firing is definitely on cost. On an energy equivalent basis, gray ammonia, which is actually currently the cheapest source of ammonia, currently costs around 4 times that of thermal coal. Now, the cost gap widens even further when you consider green ammonia, which is currently 15 times the cost of coal on an energy equivalent basis. Now, we see this cost differential being featured directly in the fuel cost component for coal-fired power plants, with fuel costs of ammonia being represented by the solid gray bars you see here. And you can see that in 2020, the gray bars actually helped to push up generation costs for ammonia co-firing compared to traditional thermal coal plants. And if you look forward down to 2030 and 2040, we don't really see the cost competitiveness of ammonia co-firing really shining through. And the reason behind it is actually backed by two different reasons. Number one, we see that there is actually limited emissions reduction potential at lower co-firing ratios of 20%. This would continue to rack up carbon costs, as illustrated by the yellow bars that you see here. Oops. Yeah. And and then the second point being that we are expecting a rather flat learning curve for ammonia co-firing, and that will lead to ammonia co-firing still being kind of high cost going on to 2030 and 2040. Now, the reason why we think that there's going to be a relatively flat learning curve is due to poor economies of scale. The use of ammonia co-firing as an end-use case is not exactly a key priority sector globally. Now, with the exception of Japan and Korea, as you can see here, the use of hydrogen and its derivatives in the power generation sector is not really being emphasized in a lot of the national hydrogen strategies that you see that are being released globally. Now, simply put, without international traction, we believe that it may be difficult to deliver on steep learning curves that's required to bring costs down to commercialize ammonia co-firing. Now, other than that, we also would like to debunk some of the claims around ammonia co-firing being green. So we'll walk everyone through why we think so with this infographic. So if you focus on the top section of this infographic, we'll like to emphasize that ammonia co-firing by itself is not going to help Japan deliver on its climate promise. Now, in 2020, Japan's grid emissions factor stands around 454 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Now, a 20% ammonia co-firing across its entire coal fleet will bring it down marginally. An aggressive co-firing ratio of around 50%, which is currently not exactly commercially established yet, we'll see grid emissions factor being brought down to 279 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. But even then, it's still more than double what is needed to align with a net zero trajectory as outlined by IEA's net zero scenario. Now, the results are even more shocking when you consider the life cycle impact. And that brings me to the lower segment of this infographic. Now, fossil-based ammonia actually contains embedded emissions equivalent to, if not double, the emissions of thermal coal-fired power plants in Japan. So unless green ammonia is being utilized, there's actually no clear net climate benefit from coal-firing. Now, other than the costs and emissions factor, ammonia co-firing also faces other technical and operational hurdles relating to flame stability, NOx control, and many others. But more importantly, we'd like to highlight that the widespread use of ammonia co-firing will most likely exacerbate energy security concerns in Japan. Now, assuming that a 20% co-firing rate is being implemented across Japan's entire coal fleet, Japan will need to import around 20 to 25 million tons of ammonia per year. And that's actually equivalent to the size of the globally traded ammonia market. So that really gives you a sense of the kind of exposure Japan is going to have on the global ammonia market. Right. So despite the technical, economic, environmental challenges that we've highlighted about ammonia's use in the power sector, we'd just like to highlight that it remains an important piece of the wider decarbonization puzzle. So here on this slide, you actually see some alternate uses of ammonia in the industrial and transport space, and they actually hold significant potential in helping to facilitate decarbonization in these harder to abate sectors. Yep, so that's all we have for ammonia. The next advanced coal technology that we really looked into is IGCC or coal gasification. I understand that this is not a priority, so I'm going to breeze through it really quickly. So in summary, we view that IGCC is a very expensive technology with very few benefits. IGCC plants make for very poor investment opportunities due to its subpar financial performance. It has a really bad track record, which saw really frequent cost blowouts and project cancellations across the few decades that it has been, since the first IGCC plant. And this is primarily due to the fact that, the technical complexity of IGCC projects are typically being underestimated. Now, moreover, unless coupled with pre-combustion CCS, IGCC plants actually do very poorly in terms of reducing emissions. And the more important fact that we like to highlight is that retrofitting IGCC plants with pre-combustion CCS is actually technically infeasible at this stage. So what this means is that investing in new IGCC plants would directly convert into new unabated coal plants, which is inconsistent with Japan's net zero ambitions and may lead to stranded assets in the future. Excuse me. So I think that's all I'm going to cover for IGCC plants. And if you're interested to know a little bit more about coal gasification, you might check out our report or our executive summary, which is available on our website. Yeah. So then I'll move on quickly to CCS or CCUS. I know that AIGCC has come up with a really good report on CCS already. So I'd just like to highlight some of the key headlines that we have in the report and provide a bit of Japan's spin on this. Right, so firstly, I would just like to highlight that, despite the media buzz, there's actually only one operating CCS-equipped coal plant that's currently running. Petronova was mothballed last year due to low oil prices, and that's after less than 5 years of operations, while Boundary Dam in Canada was in the news early this year for operational challenges. So what this clearly illustrates is that as a technology, CCS-equipped coal plants, they're not exactly as well established as how they're represented in the media or otherwise. And if we turn our attention to upcoming projects, you can clearly see that there's a market interest to scale up CCS for coal plants with 6 upcoming projects and a potential to capture up to 17 million tons of CO2 per year. However, if you place that in the context of the global emissions related to coal plants, which currently stands at 9.8 gigatons in 2020, we realize that 17 million tons is merely a drop in the ocean. Now, to add a bit of Japan's spin on this, although many of the Japanese utilities have highlighted the use of CCS or CCUS to help them in their net zero plans or decarbonization strategies, as it stands, there are no firm projects that have been announced that looks at equipping coal plants with CCS. If you consider the long project lead times for typical CCS projects in Japan, which currently stands around 7 to 8 years, CCS for coal plants in Japan may come a little too little and too late. Now, the next question on commercializing CCS or CCUS in Japan actually definitely is a question on cost. We actually often see a CCS capture cost of around $25 per ton of CO2 for pre-combustion capture, as well as $40 per ton of CO2 for post-combustion capture. And these figures are commonly cited by groups like the IEA, METI, and always used as industrial averages. However, based on our analysis, we actually see that CCS comes with a price tag of between $53 per ton of CO2 for pre-combustion capture and $74 per ton of CO2 for post-combustion capture. Now, that's even in the best case scenario, right? And that is actually double of what the IEA and METI are citing. Now, we believe that this disparity actually comes from a variety of hidden costs of CCS project development that power utilities actually have to internalize. So while METI and IEA tends to focus on technology-specific costs, our cost actually encapsulates all the project-related costs, which includes hidden costs related to energy efficiency downgrades, additional fuel costs due to the parasitic loads of CCS systems, and any other additional costs associated with project development, such as permitting, licensing, land procurement, and so on. So to put things into perspective, to deliver on a CCS project now, power utilities who are by no means CCS experts will have to engage resources for project scoping, which does not end at the capture stage, but extends to transport, storage, and utilization stages. So can you really imagine the cost adding up? And this additional cost would actually have to be internalized until an ecosystem or a value chain builds up for CCS development in Japan that allows for a plug and play kind of system for CCS. If not, all this cost would have to be internalized by the power utility looking at building up CCS capability for their coal plants. Now, lastly, Japan suffers from a hard constraint on CCS applications due to its limited storage sites. So this graph here actually shows the range of different storage potential estimates that we have in literature. And as it stands, there is actually no real consensus on the CO2 storage potential in Japan. But we believe that there is a technical storage potential for Japan at around 115 gigatons of CO2, of which we think maybe 10% is economically viable to tap. And that gives an economic storage potential of around 11.5 gigatons of CO2. Japan's annual emissions currently stand at around 1 gigaton of CO2 per year. So assuming that Japan captures all its emissions, its domestic storage sites will be depleted in about a decade. So what this points to is a clear need for Japan to exercise discretion in its allocation of storage sites. And with existing cost competitive alternatives in the power sector, including mature renewables such as solar PV and wind, we believe that the valuable capacity could be better reserved for harder to abate sectors in the industrial sectors, cement and steel, and so on. Now, so in the past few slides, we have showcased that there are quite a few restrictions with regards to the role of advanced core technologies in decarbonizing Japan's grid. So if advanced core technologies cannot be called upon to meet Japan's climate challenge, what alternatives do we have? And I think for us, the answer is pretty clear cut. We believe that renewable energy is actually the low carbon and least cost alternative to advanced coal. To start off, we'd just like to shed light quickly on the revised renewable energy potential in Japan that was released by the Ministry of Environment in 2020. This assessment really rejuvenated the kind of renewable energy sector in Japan, as it brought to light the fact that Japan actually has more than double the renewable energy potential it needs to power its economy. So then that's the resource potential question settled, and the next hurdle to cross is actually on cost. Our analysis, again, confirms the cost competitiveness of mature renewable generation technologies in Japan. From an LCOE perspective, standalone solar PV and onshore wind projects are already cheaper than coal and advanced coal technologies. Now, to account for intermittency, we have also paired up renewable energy with battery storage, and that's represented by the shaded green bars that we see in this chart. Now, battery storage is actually still high cost in Japan. And we see that pairing renewables with batteries, we'll see batteries adding around $50 per megawatt hour to renewable energy generation costs. So now renewables plus battery applications would see fierce competition with coal and the various advanced coal technologies in 2020. the situation will flip by 2030. And by 2030, we see that the majority of standalone renewable energy generation, with the exception of offshore wind, will be cheaper than coal plants. Onshore wind and solar, coupled with storage, is also cheaper than all of the coal technologies that we see. Now, this clearly showcases that from a purely cost of generation perspective, renewable energy actually wins over advanced coal technologies. I'd just like to take a moment here to pause and to highlight that our cost estimates for offshore wind technologies are actually based on conservative estimates that is based on the current project pipeline that we have for offshore wind projects in Japan. So obviously, if Japan really starts investing into developing its offshore wind potential, we will see steeper learning curves that would help to bring down the cost significantly. Yep. So beyond meeting its electricity needs, Japan also has to consider the cost effectiveness of technologies in meeting its climate commitments. And we've attempted to quantify that by charting out the marginal abatement curve for Japan's power sector. Now, based on our analysis, again, standalone solar PV as well as onshore wind projects, there are already negative abatement options available. And battery storage equipped solar PV and onshore wind, as well as standalone fixed bid offshore wind, are actually already cost competitive on a per ton of avoided carbon emissions basis than the cheapest advanced coal technology, which is represented by the black chart here, which is retrofit coal plus CCS. Now, by 2030, advanced coal technologies without CCS, they're clearly ineffective abatement opportunities, not only due to their failure to capture emissions, as you can see by the width of the bar charts here on the marginal abatement curve, but also due to high costs, as they are the most extreme right technologies that we have. Only CCS or CCUS presents itself as cost competitive abatement technologies. But then if you compare it with renewables, you can see that CCS loses its attractiveness immediately because it's actually one of the highest cost technologies in the suite. Now, what this shows again is that as an emissions reduction measure, renewable energy actually trumps advanced coal technologies. Now, I'd just like to end off quickly with policy recommendations. Right. So firstly, we'd like to recommend that Japanese policymakers reassess the role of ammonia co-firing in the power sector and prioritize applications of ammonia in the harder to abate sectors, including heavy industry and long-haul transport. But we'd like to also highlight and recommend that such discussions are based on the use of green ammonia only, as this is the only form of ammonia that comes with a clear net climate benefit. Now, moving on to AIGCC, we definitely urge policymakers to reconsider the role of AIGCC in the future energy landscape, as we regard AIGCC as a largely obsolete technology with neither financial nor climate benefits, and it doesn't really have too much competitive advantage against the other power generation technologies that we have. On CCS and CCUS, we definitely think that it has a role to play in the energy transition, but due to limited storage sites and the availability of cost-competitive renewable energy, we recommend that CCS be prioritized for harder to abate sectors, such as heavy industry. Undoubtedly, Japan would also need to start increasing its renewable energy penetration in the coming decades. And when that happens, it will have to confront the perennial problem of integrating intermittent solar PV and wind generation in a renewables dominant grid. And that would probably entail a transformation of power systems from what we are seeing today. We recommend that in the near term, Japan can help to keep integration costs low by eliminating market bias against intermittent renewable energy, while in the longer term, integration costs can be reduced through grid enhancements and reinforcements and facilitated by detailed systems level planning to reduce slack. Right. Finally, to drive home the point on the cost competitiveness of advanced coal technologies vis-a-vis renewables, we recommend that capital be shifted away from nascent clean coal technologies and towards mature renewables like solar and wind in the shorter term. And in the longer term, we definitely recommend Japanese policymakers to start looking at, facilitating capital flows into offshore wind technologies and projects to unlock significant renewable energy potential and deliver on steep learning curves. And I think that's all I have for today. I think we're still good on time. Thanks everyone. And I'll hand over back to Rebecca for Q&A.